Yesterday I spoke about the relationship between Moscow and Havana and how the role of the United States within that relationship. I've been able to look at the relationship between Moscow and Havana from the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917 up until the present, and the one kind of constant factor in that relationship is Moscow and also Havana's relationship with Washington and how that's impacted on the bilateral relationship between Moscow and Havana. Therefore, what I was trying to do in relation to the conference is what impact is the changes in US-Cuban relations and that normalization process that started. How is that going to affect the relationship between Cuba and Russia? And what I also did yesterday as well, I also spoke a little bit about the role of Latin America within that as well. So again, to fit into the nature of the conference. As an example, in the post-Soviet period, then the relationship has generally been good, particularly from the mid-1990s onwards. But even in that earlier period from 1992 to 1995, when the relationship did deteriorate, as Moscow's foreign policy became much more Western-looking, the United States was still important as Moscow tried to improve its relationship with Washington. From the mid-1990s, the relationship improved between Moscow and Havana, and the reasons for that were really changes in both Cuban foreign policy and also Russian foreign policy as well. With regard to Cuban foreign policy, a number of the issues were spoken about during the conference. It's the idea of, as some authors have said, Cuba trying to create a third world constituency, or as George Dominguez was speaking about yesterday as well, about Cuban foreign policy and its diplomacy, particularly within international organizations, and that's been fundamental for the change in the relationship with Russia. Conversely, Russian foreign policy has evolved and changed, partly due to its Western-looking foreign policy of the early 1990s not working, and also things or issues such as NATO expansion and NATO's treatment of their fellow Serbs in Yugoslavia, increasing a role in nationalism in Russian politics and foreign policy. The result is that Russia desires a multipolar world, and that's kind of maybe a shared goal with Cuban foreign policy as well. Those issues or those pretexts for the changes in Russian foreign policy in the 21st century have given rise to what some call the Putin doctrine, which is this idea that there's also this emergence of ideas such as the Weimar syndrome or the besieged fortress mentality, where Russia is surrounded by steadily encroaching enemies, with obviously the idea being the West. Therefore, this Putin doctrine has been designed, or some people would say it's been designed to try and counter these, and therefore as it counters these, to try and garner support for itself. And this is important for its policy towards Cuba, because part of the desire of the Putin foreign policy is to have a much more expansive foreign policy and this desire for a multipolar world. Therefore, these changes in both Cuba and Russian foreign policy have resulted in a convergence in this desire for a multipolar world, but also it's resulted in other issues becoming important. So returning to that idea about Cuba's foreign policy trying to create a third world constituency, Russia, although not part of the developing world, has been able to back Cuba in various different forums, particularly United Nations forums, really from the mid-1990s onwards, which it didn't do between 1992 and 1995. In turn, Cuba has also been able to side with Russia in these forums, various different examples, maybe 2008 over the Georgian War, 2013 over Syria, and then last year in 2014 over the unfolding situation in the Ukraine. So it's important for these kind of convergences that are taking place and how both can help each other in these international forums. Other things have become important. Trade, although it remains very low between Cuba and Russia, the political will is there for trade to increase. Highly significantly, in July 2014, the Cuba-Soviet era debt was written off, with the final 10% being paid in kind with Russian investment into the Cuban economy. So trade's important, or could become more important, regarding on this political will. Other things that have become or have changed is that you now have more Russian tourists visiting Cuba. You have an increase in cultural links, and maybe best shown by, in 2010, Russia being the guest of honor at the Havana International Book Fair, and also the fact that you have a reconceptualization of the relationship taking place in both countries, trying to demonstrate to the generation of Cubans and Russians that were born after 1991 and the end of Soviet-Cuban relations about the longevity of the relationship. Therefore, what I would suggest is that the relationship's mutually beneficial for both countries, and it's not just the role of the United States that's been this constant factor. Therefore, going back to the beginning and this idea that once the normalization process starts between Cuba and the United States, Does it mean that suddenly Cuban-Russian relations are going to change? I would suggest that that's not the case. Highly significantly, Raul Castro was in Moscow last week for the celebrations for the end of the Second World War. 70 invitations were given, but only 20 world leaders actually attended the ceremony. So it's really quite a graphic illustration of basically Cuba's not going to give up on an old friend. It's not suddenly going to change its foreign policy towards Russia. As well as this is the fact that Cuba remains important for Russia with regards to Latin America and trying to garner support within Latin America and maybe end the isolation of Russia that's maybe taken place over the last year. Commerce has been important for Russia's reassertion into the region, but now it's also political as well, being important. So although there was talks this week between Kerry and Putin and Lavrov, it's going to be a long process. Just again, last week at the celebrations for the end of the Second World War, Putin was talking about being unhappy with attempts to create a unipolar world, not the most diplomatic language for US foreign policy. Therefore, what I would conclude is that really the relationship between Cuba and Russia, it's multifaceted, it's mutually beneficial, it's not just the role of the United States, and simply as change with the United States is going to take time for Cuba, it's not going to just suddenly change its foreign policy. So therefore, in the kind of final conclusion, suggests that Russian-Cuban relations are likely to remain in their present form for the short to medium term.